Hi guys, it's Tamara Hartheiner here again, and this time I am bringing you episode 2, Little Dog Lost, from the epic misadventures of Caden Parker, Old High Nights, Year 1, age 10. Chapter 1, Dust and Construction. There was a bittersweet feeling in the mess hall during breakfast on Saturday morning. It was almost time to say goodbye to the friends who had surrounded Caden for a week, and he would miss them. But more than that was a churning excitement in his chest at the thought of seeing his mom again in just a few hours. Judging from the anxious looks of the other boys as they glanced either at the clock or the camp entrance, he wasn't the only one. They packed all their bags and set everything in a nice, neat pile by the cabin door before heading to the chalet for one last round of songs and skits. Caden sat with his group of friends and cheered and roared and stomped his feet along with everyone else. Halfway through the music, the door to the chalet opened and a few adults trickled in. Caden watched them curiously. Who were they, and why were they at camp? They went to an empty row of benches behind the campers and sat down. Then the door opened again, and another handful of grown-ups came in. Ethan lifted his head while doing the actions to chicka-boom-boom, and suddenly his whole face lit up. "Mom," he said. One of the women who had sat down on the bench smiled and waved, and then Caden knew who these people were. They were parents. Now he couldn't keep his eyes from the door. At any moment, it might be his mother walking in. He tried to concentrate on the songs, but instead of watching his counselor, his gaze kept flicking to the entrance. And finally, there she was, coming in the door with his little sister Elsa in tow. Caden sat up on his bench and waved his arms wildly, just in case she missed him. Mrs. Parker smiled and waved back, and Elsa climbed her way forward to Caden and threw her arms around him, light brown hair wild and wavy around her face. His mom ran a hand through her dark hair and motioned for Elsa to come back. Then they settled down on a bench with the other parents. Caden sang and did the actions, even more now that his mom was watching. He just wanted to go home. He kept turning around to look at them, and his mom would smile, then gesture for him to turn back around. Finally, they finished with the songs, and the camp director stood up. He said a few words about what a great summer it had been and how he hoped they would all come back next year. Then he had the counselors line up so the campers could walk through the line and give them all hugs goodbye. Caden rushed through the line, giving them all a quick hug before hurrying to his mom's side. "Mom, I missed you so much." He didn't say that, though. He was going into 5th grade. He certainly couldn't be relying so much on his mom. Instead, he tickled his little sister, who laughed and giggled and ran circles around him. "Caden, Caden!" Ethan ran over and grabbed Caden's arm. "You have to meet my mom. She said we can plan to come together next year." "Oh, right, and this is my mom." Caden introduced them, and Mrs. Parker smiled and nodded, though she already looked a little tired. "All right, Caden, say bye to your friends and let's get your things." Levi and Brock were waiting at the cabin, and they all exchanged phone numbers. Mrs. Parker went over to talk to their counselor, Blade, and Caden faced his friends. "So we're in agreement," Levi said. "We'll all be back next year." Caden nodded vigorously along with the others. "I'll sell my diamond," Ethan said, referencing the yellow gemstone he'd found when they went caving. "I'm sure I'll have enough money for camp." Caden had no idea if his mom would want him to come again, but he hoped so, especially if he would see his friends again. "I'll be back next summer for sure," he said. "Group picture," Mrs. Parker said, hooking his duffel bag over her arm. Caden threw his arms around his friends and smiled big for the camera. "Bye! Bye!" they called. They climbed into their separate vehicles, and Caden hung out the car window and waved until they faded from view. Then he faced front as they drove along the path the other cars were taking out of camp. "Well, did you have fun? Was it something you would want to do again?" his mom asked. "I loved it," Caden said. He proceeded to launch into a detailed explanation of the week, everything from getting sick to caving to the would-be diamonds. "Sounds like quite an adventure. I'm so glad you had a nice time." By now they had passed out of the busier part of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and were driving through a long stretch of farmland on their way back to Arkansas. "Did you get my letter?" Mrs. Parker asked. "Yeah." Caden pulled his bag into his lap and rummaged through it until he found the letter. "I read it every day. Thanks for writing me. So did you write me back after you got my letter?" His mom shook her head. "I just got your letter today. Your counselor gave it to me. He forgot to mail it." "Oh," Caden frowned, thinking. "How did you know I've been sick?" "I didn't. I just worried about you because I know how often you get sick. I mailed your letter on Monday because I wanted to make sure it got to you on time. Oh, okay. But it still didn't quite make sense. What about the bracelet? Caden asked, a sudden jolt of fear rushing through him. If his counselor hadn't mailed the letter. What bracelet? His mom's question confirmed his worst fears. Caden put a hand on the door handle, ready to demand his mother turn the car around and go back. I made you a bracelet. I found all of these really cool beads with emojis and words, and it said best mom ever. Caden scrunched his nose up, fighting the heat of tears behind his eyes. Oh, honey, he must have forgotten to give it to me. Caden blinked rapidly, but the tears were escaping anyway. He swiped them angrily, feeling stupid for crying, but super annoyed with Blade for forgetting. We have to go back. I'm sure he still has it. Caden, we're not going back. It's more than an hour behind us. His mom shot him a sympathetic look. It's so sweet that you made that for me. Even though I didn't get it, just knowing you made it makes me happy. Caden didn't want his mom to be happy just from the thought. I wanted to see you wearing it. I wanted to see you happy every time you looked at it. Looking down at his own wrist, he pulled off the bracelet he had made for himself. Here, it's not the same one, but at least it's something. His mom looked at him as she took the bracelet, her eyebrows arching upward. Thank you, sweetie. This one will be just as special to me as the other. Caden looked out the window without saying another word, quietly wiping the last of the tears away. It wasn't the same. Mrs. Parker parked the SUV in the driveway to the brick house 2 hours after they had left camp, and Caden shoved open the door, suddenly anxious to get inside, to see Jack and his dad. Take your stuff in, his mom yelled. Grumbling under his breath, Caden yanked out his duffel bag and sleeping bag, managing to sandwich the pillow on top of them. He lugged them into the house and dropped them in the tile entryway. Caden, a voice called from the kitchen. Caden went around the fireplace just as his brother Jack came out of the dining room. Caden, Jack said, and only in that moment did Caden realize how much he had missed his older brother. Although nobody could ever make him as mad as Jack did, nobody was ever as kind or understanding either. 2 years older than Caden and taller by nearly a foot, Jack had hair that was almost black, just like their mom, and a matching olive skin tone. Jack! Caden dropped his stuff and ran over to Jack, giving him a huge brotherly hug. How was it? Jack asked. Did you have tons of fun? So much, Caden said. You should definitely come next year. Jack nodded. If Scout Camp isn't the same week, maybe I'll come next year. Caden let go of Jack and walked into the kitchen. Is Dad here? Your dad's at the new house, Mrs. Parker said, coming in behind them. In fact, he wants us all to come over. We only have a few more weeks before we move, and he wants you guys to see it. Caden's eyes went wide. He could hardly believe they would be moving soon. His dad had been building their house for almost 2 years. To think the time was really here to move. It had just become such a normal part of life to live in one house while they built another. Can we go now? Mrs. Parker nodded. Let me just make some lunch, and then we'll head over. And that's all we will read from episode 2, Little Dog Lost. See you in a week.